recording.
Sounds cool.
All right, we're live.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our workshop tonight on informational interviewing. I'm Marianne Cowan in the Center for Purposeful Work, and I will let my two colleagues introduce themselves also, and then we'll get going.
Thanks, Marianne. I'm Amy Jaffe, and I also work in the Center for Purposeful Work. And I'm happy to be presenting with my colleagues here tonight, and thank you for joining us.
And I'm Peter Osborne, and you guessed it, I also work in the Center for Purposeful Work, and I'm excited to be doing this workshop as part of our series throughout the summer.
So we are recording this, this workshop, and we will post it on our YouTube playlist on the Bates College YouTube channel, along with all of our other workshops and videos. We'll also share out the slides and resources that we go through this evening to those of you on the line, and then anyone else who views the workshop. So Peter, if you want to go to the agenda. So here's what we'll cover tonight. We'll talk about the purpose of informational interviewing, which is different from, obviously, from interviewing for a position. We'll talk about how to find which people are the best to do an informational interview with, how to initiate that process, prepare for it, plan for what questions to ask the person, and then how to follow up and continue that relationship afterwards. So the purpose of an informational interview, also sometimes called a research interview, so that gives you a clue as to the purpose. You may want to learn about an industry, about a specific company or organization, maybe a specific role that you're looking into. You can get the person's history, ask them about their career path or their educational path, ask them advice on getting, on doing job search. You can also get their advice on clarifying your career goals and expanding your professional network. So all kinds of reasons to do an informational interview around the job or career exploration topic. So an informational interview is basically an informal conversation with someone, but you should still prepare for the conversation with some ground rules and some best practices in mind. And so that's what we will share with you here. And we're certainly at the center always happy to help you prepare and then to help you practice the techniques of an informational interview. Oh, Peter, you are muted.
All right, take two. I think that generally the concept of informational interviewing as part of networking and building professional connections can be kind of mysterious to people unnecessarily. So a couple of things that you want to keep in mind, especially when you're reaching out to people within the Bates network for informational interviewing. Most people are very, very flattered by requests for help or guidance. And I don't think you have to worry about intruding on people or feeling like you're asking too much of them by reaching out to them to ask for an informational interview conversation. There is kind of this line you want to be aware of and not cross, and that's kind of the difference between seeking advice and referrals and seeking information and asking for a job or going into a conversation with the intent of getting a job out of that. Informational interviewing really is a building block to building relationships with people, which is the purpose of networking, and not, networking when done correctly and when done well is not transactional, it's relational. So by seeking out advice and seeking out referrals and guidance from somebody who agrees to do an informational interview with them, that's really the most fruitful way to approach this conversation. And I think you want to use the opportunity really to explore and learn as much as you can. And we're going to talk about some techniques that you can use to get the most out of these conversations. And informational interviewing really is as much art as it is science. So there's an aspect of that when you get to know somebody and talk to them, the areas in which you can maybe go off script a little bit with them and start exploring some other areas. But we'll talk more about that as we go. So the first step really in informational interviewing and building your professional network is finding people to interview. And you really want to start with people you already know. And so you can start with contacts that you may have on LinkedIn, some alumni who have recently entered fields or occupations that interest you. And two tools that we really utilize and kind of coach students on using a lot to do this are LinkedIn and Batesbridge. And we actually put on the bottom of this slide two past videos of two past workshops on using LinkedIn to find new professional connections, and then utilizing Batesbridge to find connections within the Bates network. And there's a really interesting tool on LinkedIn called the Alumni Finder, where you can search just within people who attended Bates on LinkedIn and sort them by geographic location, type of work that they do, type of industry they're in, what they majored in. So that can be a really interesting career exploration tool. And the thing that I like about Batesbridge, there are a smaller number of alumni who are currently on Batesbridge, but those people are already self-selected. They've self-selected into that system because they want to support students and other alumni. So just by going on Batesbridge to find alumni, that platform has done some of the work, some of the kind of prospecting for you already. So take some time if you're new to either of these tools to maybe check out our videos. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about these tools because both of those workshops do a really good job of giving an introduction, but these are kind of the two primary tools that we talk with students about. Some other ways that you can find connections and people to interview are through professional organizations. So within certain industries or even certain occupations, there are professional organizations. Like, for example, the three of us are members of the Maine Career Development Association, which is a professional organization for career development professionals in the state of Maine. There's a National Career Development Association. There are all kinds of these professional organizations. And oftentimes these professional organizations have member directories that you can utilize to try and find new connections either within geographic areas or types of organization in the industry. Sometimes these professional organizations do require you to be a member to access the member directory. If that's the case, you might inquire with them about a student rate for membership, which is often very affordable, or if you're really kind, maybe they'll just give it to you for free. Of course, professional organizations also host conferences and they have professional development opportunities, which are also great ways to make new connections within areas of interest. If you have a specific company or organization in mind, LinkedIn allows you to search for specific job titles within a company or organization. So that can be a really useful way to find people in a certain job in a certain organization to have an informational conversation. And of course, going along with the principle of start with people you already know, talk to anybody who will listen about what you're interested in and ask them if they have any ideas of specific people you should speak with to learn more. Even better, are they willing to introduce you to somebody who is doing something that is interesting to you? And we'll talk a little bit more about that's the network in networking, right? Leveraging one level of connections to kind of gain access to another level of connections. Another really useful resource, not to belabor the point, that's not on this slide, but is the Vault guides that all students have access to for free via Handshake. The Vault career guides list within different industries the types of professional organizations that are most prominent within those industries. They also can be really helpful giving you some ideas and language to use in searching for specific job titles. If you're looking for a really specific job function to have an informational interview, the Vault guides can be really helpful in giving you some of that language to do searching.
Thanks, Peter. So once you've identified someone who you want to reach out to, and you think that person would be valuable to you in terms of your goals and networking, job searching, or maybe simply exploring career paths or occupations, it's time to make an initial contact. And this piece can sometimes be the sticking point. I hear from students that they just don't know how to do this. They don't know what to say. I'm going to make a few suggestions on how to approach this. And first, I'll start out by pointing out there are a couple different mechanisms to make the initial contact. Email is certainly a pretty straightforward one if you have the person's email address. Reaching out on LinkedIn is a bit different. And then Batesbridge, I would say, is one of the easiest ways to make the connection. It's one of the reasons why we love this tool, not only because, as Peter said, these alumni have opted in and volunteered to connect with students. They're sort of like willing, waiting participants. But Batesbridge also has a system that gives you, it actually gives you a template for the message you would send to the contact. So it's all sort of queued up for you to simply revise some details in the message and click send. So pretty straightforward. And those templates could be something you could even copy and then use in your own email as well. So I encourage students to get onto Batesbridge and explore the templates that are suggested in the tool. Makes it really easy. But of course, maybe you found the perfect person on LinkedIn that you're going to reach out to, or you're just going to contact them via email. And so in any of these formats, important part of this is to be concise and to be specific and to ask for something. So there are three key components of a message here. The first is, who are you? You may be contacting someone who's a stranger and they don't know you from anyone else, but you certainly have found them most likely through a warm connection. You may have something in common with them. That's what we consider a warm connection, is you have you have a shared experience or background or person in your life. So the warm connection doesn't really know you, but you need to explain first who you are. I'm a Bates student. And then why are you reaching out? Because I saw that you are you majored in the same thing at Bates, and I'm interested in your career path as a geology major. And so that's really important to explain the reason. And I think that I guess I want to pause here and encourage you to get clear on what that reason is before you write this message. Are you exploring career paths? Are you seeking advice about getting a job? Are you trying to understand what skills are required for a certain occupation? So if you're thinking about the reason for your informational interview, you want to very concisely explain that here. And then, what are you asking for? Typically, what you're asking for is advice. You're looking for some advice or information that they can share with you about their experience. So the message is going to be a lot more concise than what I just said. In fact, I'll give you an example in a minute, but it builds upon itself. So you're explaining who you are, why you're reaching out, and then what you hope for next. Here's an example. I'm Christy, and I recently graduated from Bates. I'm looking specifically to obtain an entry-level position in the company you work for. I'd be interested in talking with you about your path there or any advice you have to share. If you're available for that, please let me know. And we've suggested a few subject lines here. We actually think if you're writing an email that you want to be very, very specific in your email and write something that actually explains the email. So here are a few examples. Connect with Bates student for advice, right? Isn't that what you're asking them for? Or Bates student connection. Especially if you're reaching out to a Bates alum, you want to get the word Bates into that subject line so they know that you're not just a random stranger. You're instead a Bates, you're a warm stranger with a connection to them. All right, so next is the preparation. So if you've asked clearly for some advice, you probably have then heard back from them. Yes, I'd be happy to talk with you. Let's talk by Zoom or talk by phone, or in a different time it was meet in person, but you're likely to have arranged that. Now, if you're using Batesbridge, the Batesbridge actually has a whole scheduling system and video chat technology built in. That's all easy for you. But what I would recommend is arranging that over email with the contact that you're meeting with. And then you want to prepare. So as Peter and Marianne both suggested, this is, it's informal, but it is something that you want to be prepared for. And this is a person who wants to help you, but because you've initiated the contact, you're going to be the leader of this conversation. You're going to have to start the conversation. You're going to, you're really setting the agenda for this conversation. So the first part of preparing is to actually have an introductory paragraph, so to speak, to the conversation where you introduce yourself. And this is going to be in more depth than what you wrote in your email. This is actually sharing a little bit more about yourself. I might think of planning for a 2-minute introduction here, where you're explaining not only what your experience is, maybe your class year major, your areas of interest, activities you're involved in, but the goals of your conversation as they relate to your professional interests. So again, we're going to go back to why do you want this conversation in the first place? So if you can explain that as a recent graduate, you're particularly interested in communications. You've been involved with journalism and communications while you were on campus, maybe in a on-campus job or in a club or activities that you're involved with. You've begun to have an interest in that field and you want to learn more. And you're also looking for your next step. You're hoping to get some advice from them around work, entry-level work in the communications field. So you want to sort of plan out that opening paragraph to your conversation and give a bit more information about why that area interests you, maybe a little bit about what you know already, and then what you don't know yet. So you might know what it's like to write for a student newspaper, but you don't know much about writing for online magazine, and you're interested in learning more about that from them based on their experience. And you also may be wondering, how does somebody go about getting a job in this area? And so that would be something you'd be leading up to in that conversation, but explaining in your opening. And finally, you want to express your appreciation. This is a person who wants to help you, but is a very busy professional. So make sure that you are clear about how much time you're going to spend in the conversation, appreciate them for the time that they're offering, and stick to the plan that if you've established a 30-minute conversation, that's going to be the limit of the time that you'll have to talk with them, and honor that. Okay. Another part of your preparation is doing some research. And so a part of informational interviewing is to make sure that you're actually gathering information that you couldn't otherwise get somewhere else. And so we strongly recommend that you do as much research in advance to know what you're going to be talking about with this person. Know them a little bit, know their field a little bit, and then you're able to contribute to the conversation as well as ask really smart questions about the topic that you're exploring with them. So these are a few ideas for places to do your research. Reading their LinkedIn profile. Let's say you did find them through a personal connection or an introduction and you haven't read their profile yet. Make sure you understand what their professional story looks like on LinkedIn. Batesbridge actually integrates LinkedIn profiles, so you'd be able to research that on Batesbridge as well. Read their company's website, get to know what their company's all about. You don't want to be asking something like, so what does your company do? You want to understand that in advance so you can ask a smart question about what their work is like there. Peter mentioned the Vault Guides. Those are outstanding resources. You can find them through Handshake. Those give very thorough overviews of what very different industries are all about. So I like that resource also to identify different titles within an industry. So let's say you are interested in communication or journalism. Well, what are the entry-level job titles? If you could research that in advance, then you would go into an informational interview prepared to ask, does your company have this type of job? Knowing that it's an entry-level position. Not that you'd be asking if that company has a job opening necessarily, but you'd want to know, does that company typically hire people in this entry-level role? See that? I'm trying to walk that fine line that Peter talked about earlier. Are you asking for a job? Or are you asking, no, you're asking for information about the job potential. And finally, I love this strategy of using Google or Google News or Google Alerts to track to see if there's any recent news about the organization. This is going to help you be really up to date on what is going on for the person that you're meeting with, so that you can ask very pertinent, relevant questions of that person about some recent event that perhaps their organization was involved with, or press release, or some announcement that they had made. So those are a couple strategies for preparing in advance.
Thanks, Amy. So you have prepared by doing your research about the person, the industry, the specific company or the role. The next step in preparation is coming up with a list of questions that you can ask. I think you want to plan for a 30-minute conversation, with the understanding that you may get on a roll and really hit it off with this person, especially if you've got some things in common and it's a warm contact. But being respectful of their time, planning for 30 minutes is a good idea. And you want to come with 10 to 12 questions to ask. You probably won't hit all of those questions, but it's always a good idea to come prepared with more questions than you'll ask. And we have a list of suggested questions, and you can do additional research and find many, many lists online and in Handshake resources of good, smart questions to ask, depending on what you want to get out of the informational interview. But thinking in general about the categories that you'll cover probably in your conversation, you want to give them a chance to talk about their background and their career path. Everybody loves to tell their story, and you definitely want to allow them to do that and get information, gain some good knowledge from that. Their job, the work that they do, their organization and their industry, and then getting some practical advice from them, how to get a job, what advice they have for you in your career search or your internship search, or if this is about grad school, in your grad school search. And then you always want to ask them about referrals. Who's another person I could talk to? Who might you be able to introduce me to that would also be helpful in my exploration? So that first set of questions, here are a few examples of those kinds of questions. And again, people do love to tell their story. And it really is helpful to hear how they talk about their experiences and their path, what choices they made, what pivots they made, and why. Why they chose, a next step, or what happened to influence that decision. And as they're telling their story, try putting yourself in their shoes, try imagining yourself in the same situation and ask follow-up questions about that. Be an active listener, especially when they're telling their own story, because that's such a special thing to them. And then the next category of questions here, here's a pretty long list of examples, and there are more, but finding out additional information, more than you did online in your preparatory research, about their role, about the organization, their company or organization that they work for. Ask some intelligent, insightful questions about their industry, maybe current events around it that you researched, maybe how it impacts things that are happening in the world right now with the economy, or with racial equity, or with the environment, or however, whatever you're curious about how their industry or their company acts in the world. Those are some really good, insightful, deep diving questions that will give you a great conversation, but also show that you're interested and give you a broader base of knowledge for future conversations and future interviews for internships and jobs, and future, cover letters that you write. So everything you can learn about a company or an industry is going to help you in your exploration and searching afterwards. And I guess just making the conversation feel both informal and engaged, letting the person know how interested you genuinely are in the information and in the knowledge exchange that you're engaging in, will just be a positive experience for them and for you.
Thank you, Marianne. The next category of questions or topics of conversation you may want to bring up is how to get a job in that field. The reason why I think this topic is so important is because almost every industry kind of has a predominant way that people move into and around it. So for example, there are a lot of industries where relationships and personal connections and having somebody on the inside to vouch for you is really important. They may just be so competitive that it's just so much harder to get an in if you don't, or to get a job in that field without having a connection. There are other types of organizations that are on the extreme opposite end of that, right? I used to work for state government, and I was on a couple of search committees, and it did not matter who on the search committee knew an applicant. We were going to evaluate every single applicant on the same exact criteria, ask them the same exact questions, right? So the best way to figure that out for a specific field or industry is to talk to someone who has a lot of experience in that field. The one caveat I would say about asking about how did somebody get a job is that the nature of job searching has changed a lot over time. And so if somebody entered a specific field 30 years ago, 40 years ago, maybe not even that long ago, what worked for them may actually be very bad advice for you now. My personal example, my dad was looking for a job he's a tradesperson, he's a pipe fitter, and he was telling me, well, I'm gonna go and drop in at that shop and check in on my application. And I'm like, no, nobody wants you to do that, actually. So it's just like, that's just an example of how things change over time. That was really good advice at one point in time when he was in the early stages of his career. And it's not always that great advice right now. So, and then the final topic of conversation is getting advice and referrals from the people that you're talking to. So you should always leave an informational interview with some action steps. That should be one of your goals, is that when you end that conversation, you have some pieces of advice from the person you interview that you can follow up upon. Like, for example, from these questions, you might have some new types of jobs or careers to research. You might make a list of new people you want to talk to based on that information. they may tell you to do or advise that you do certain things, like get connected to a professional organization, like we talked about before. So that's the most important part of asking these types of questions is what are you going to do after this conversation? You also, and um, my favorite question is the last one on this slide, based on this conversation today. Who else do you think I should talk to? Who else should I be connecting with now that you know a little bit more about what I'm interested in and what I want to learn? That's the network part of networking, right? A network is you connect to somebody you know, and through that person, you connect to connections that they have, and that's how you build a network. That's why we use the term networking. But if you don't ask that question, it's not networking. You're not really leveraging the power of the people who are in your network and who are in your corner. So that's why it's so important that you leave that conversation with some action steps and hopefully some referrals of more people you can speak with. And then finally, I said this earlier and it bears repeating 100 times, that these types of conversations are relational and not transactional. They are relational, not transactional. And so part of it being relational and part of building relationship is that your connection to this person should not end at the conclusion of your conversation. This is an opportunity for you to build a genuine relationship with a person. The relationship is going to be valuable in and of itself because we are human beings, we are social creatures. At some point down the road, that relationship may be leveraged for something related to your professional goals or the connection's professional goals, right? This is the two-way thing. But never forget that relationship comes first and is the most important thing. So a couple of really simple ways that you can kind of foster that relationship after you finish the conversation is sending a prompt thank you note or letter within 24 hours of your interview. And we had a great, robust conversation in our workshop last week about interviewing and whether handwritten or email was better. I think this one, the stakes are a little bit different and the intentions are a little bit different. So I think whatever you feel most comfortable doing would be fine. Refer to a specific topic or a piece of advice that you really appreciated in the conversation. Take action on any referrals or introductions that they offer to make. And then follow up on your progress with any other suggestions that they make to you. And because it bears repeating, networking is relational, not transactional.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to continue along the line of the fact that this is you're establishing a relationship with this person. It's relational, as Peter said, and give a few other suggestions on what to do in the longer term. So what Peter talked about as follow-up right after you have an informational interview is one thing. But if you are actually going to create a relationship with this person, there are several things you can do over time to build and maintain that connection that you made with them. So one piece is to simply stay in touch. And by that, I mean connect over LinkedIn, connect over a period of time by sharing an article, giving an update, writing back with a question. And a lot of people who do this really well, so think about this in time frames like 3 weeks, 6 weeks, every month. And some people even set a schedule for staying in touch with their network so that they're nurturing that by having sort of touch points with these people. But another piece I want to mention is that your job search is your responsibility. And so even if someone has ended an informational interview by saying, I'll definitely help, it's actually your responsibility to check in with them on whatever the next steps are. So let's say they end by telling you that they'd like to introduce you to a few other people at their company. My suggestion is that it's your job to next reach out to them and take responsibility for what that looks like by following up and saying, I'm really excited to meet the people you'd like to introduce me to. Could I send you my resume so that you can forward that to them? Or you might follow up and say, is there anything else you need from me so that I can be made, so that you can connect me with the people that you mentioned. They might even suggest that there is a job at their organization. Well, that's going to be your responsibility to apply to that job. But the way that you can maintain the relationship is to keep them up to date. Let them know you've applied. Let them know that you've reached out to those other people. Let them know that you had a great meeting with those other people. Let them know that those people were so helpful to you. And so, although this person may be your first connection in the network, every time your network builds, you circle back to this person because this person helped you build whatever the next step was in your network, or may have even helped you get the next opportunity. And so the relationship is strengthened by you keeping them up to date, keeping them included, having them be involved in that experience, that success of yours. The other piece here is that we want to encourage you to reflect on whatever your learning was in an informational interview. And there may be information that you learned in that informational interview that that helped you identify something about what you don't want to do, or an organization you wouldn't want to work for, or maybe a different path that came up in the conversation. And so we just want to remind you that just because you had an informational interview with a certain person in a certain industry, it doesn't marry you to that path. In fact, it's your process, your reflection, your purpose, your pathway. And so remember to take time to think about what it means to you based on what they've shared with you. And again, that piece is your responsibility. So perhaps be sure to maintain your own boundaries. If their help is not helpful to you going forward in your job search, that's okay to say, thank you, it's great to hear about your organization. I'm actually taking a different tact in my job search now. And thank you so much for your advice. I learned a lot from our conversation. So respectfully honor your own choices and decisions in this process. And then I think I've talked about this probably enough, but the whole idea of learning about a new person who becomes part of your network at the end of an informational interview suggests actually that we start again with this whole process and we go back to the beginning of the presentation. We won't do that, but where we will say, you have a new person who's in your network. What's your plan? Initiate contact. Think about what the questions are. Research that person, prepare yourself, and then conduct another informational interview. And trust me, this process, once you get started on it, it's so engaging and energizing, and you really can't we can't even describe to you how much you're going to learn through the process, because it's just it's exceptional how valuable this process is once you get going. So if you get a suggestion, definitely follow up with the next person. And if you're have questions about this, I know we're going to make time for questions at the end here, but if you have questions, we are happy to meet with you for a one-on-one conversation to discuss your strategy. We'd be happy to help you plan your interviews. We'd be happy to conduct a mock interview. And I think we all actually engage in informational interviewing ourselves, both sharing what our work is like with other people who are interested in us. I always say yes when people ask me for that. And then I'm always interested in learning what other people are doing for work. So it's sort of a lifelong process. But anyways, we're all steeped in this, and we'd be happy to talk with you about how to do it. And okay, finally, a few specific resources. So we're going to share this presentation with you afterwards. But you'll find that this link to Batesbridge takes you right into that tool, so you can find alumni who have offered to connect with students. There's also the LinkedIn Bates Alumni Finder page that this will take you directly to. Peter mentioned earlier. As mentioned, we had a previous workshop on LinkedIn as well as Batesbridge. Those are both on our YouTube channel. And finally, within Handshake, you can find the Vault guides for additional industry research. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to check in with our participants to see if there are any questions that we can answer.
Yes, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you. I learned so much. I do have one question right now. So assuming that I've gone through this entire process, I conduct the research, I do the interviews, then send the thank you notes, make my social networking process go quite smoothly, and I have this established base, I guess. But let's say, once I've done all this, I decide to, again, maybe take a change of pace, maybe a new direction in my social networking journey, say I find a new opportunity, I want to pursue that instead. What do I do with these connections that I've established and made? Is it okay to keep them? Is it for future reference perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Because remember that networking is relational, not transactional.
Okay.
So the relationship has value in and of itself.
Okay. All right then.
And you may 10, 15 years from now pivot again, or they may do the same, and you may find some reason to want to be back in touch with them in the future for some other reason, or they may find a reason to be in touch with you for the same the same type of need for information or connections. Yeah, so it's always good to keep those relationships live, and you don't have to be as frequent as time goes on, for sure, but even touching in once every 6 months or so with people who you've been in touch with is a nice thing.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. That will be all.
I just wanted to say thank you. I missed the first part of the presentation, but the rest of it was really helpful, so thank you.
You're welcome. We'll share the slides with you, Esmeralda. So, and there will be a recording of this, but if you look at the slides and you're like, wow, I have some questions or I want to talk this through, certainly contact any of us and we'd be happy to converse with you about it.
All right, I'll do that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to just tell my quick story of the last time I did an informational interview. I had to do it for my career development class, my FCD course. And so I've always had an interest in maybe holding elected office. And so I reached out to my state representative and asked if she'd be willing to have a conversation with me. And she said, actually, why don't you come to Augusta tomorrow? You can be my guest at, she happened to be a Democratic legislator at the Democratic caucus meeting for the House of Representatives tomorrow morning. And then you can join us for our session during the day and we'll have lunch together and all of that. So she introduced me to the entire Democratic caucus in the Maine House of Representatives. And it's because I just reached out to her and showed an interest in that. And I got so much more out of it than I had ever asked for. So you just never know what's going to come of this.
Great story. I did not know that, Peter. That is fantastic.
Yeah.
What an experience, just by simply daring to ask. That's great.
I will say that when students or alumni come back to me and say, hey, I got in touch with that person you suggested I get in touch with, and it was really helpful, and it led to this next conversation. That is so fulfilling to me to know that my advice was useful and helpful, and that the person thought enough to get back in touch with me to say thank you and here's the result of this. So that's another personal story about how well this system works.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming and for joining us for this workshop. So next Thursday at 7, we'll have another workshop, this on refreshing your resume. And you can look for information about that on Bates Today or Bates This Week during the summer and our Purposeful Work newsletters. And have a good evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take care.
Bye.
Good night.